This is Jackie Markham. The date is the 12th of November 2022, and I'm talking to John Neville Chamberlain, who was born in Myrtle House in Kingsland on the 18th of April 1940, and this is where he lived with his grandparents until he was 17. Very nice of you to come and talk to us, John. Would you like to tell me a little bit about? Off you go.
My first memory of Myrtle House, Kingsland indeed, was as about a 1-year-old lying in my pram with a hood up and looking up at this blue sky on the front porch outside Myrtle House, which is on Lugg Lane, Kingsland. I was a restless little child and for ages didn't realise why I was restless until I found out that as part of the family tradition, my ears were pinned back with tape so that I couldn't bend them and end up growing to look like an elephant with my ears sticking out. And that's why I was a restless little child of 1 year old. But I do remember the songs of the birds and the sky and the clouds at the tender age of 1 year old. Moving forward, or not fast forward, but to 4 years old, and during that time I'd made friends with Jennifer Priest, who lived just round the corner. And at 4, we both were going to start school on the same day, in the Easter term of 1944. For this great occasion, I'd been kitted out in a brand new outfit, which I was extremely proud of. And this consisted of new short trousers with scratchy underpants, woolen socks that came up to my knees, and black shiny boots, after which I would be responsible for cleaning, which I didn't realise at that time. We had no one to help us, and it didn't seem daunting that Jennifer and I think holding hands, walked from outside Myrtle House down to Kingsland School on what was to be our first day's education. What a start, and what a lovely little walk.
Who were your teachers in those days?
We quickly found other friends in the school, some of whom we knew, some we didn't. And that's the process of both growing up and education. But we had some lovely teachers, 2 ladies who I remember fondly to this day, because they were the beginning of putting up with me and my boisterous ways and asking silly questions. I remember the one lady's surname was certainly Morgan, and I do believe the other was a sister or relative of her. I mustn't repeat the nickname we had for her, because today it wouldn't be appropriate or...
Fair enough, but it stayed with you. And the headmaster was Mr.
Headmaster was C.T. Jones, or as I got to know as I got older, Charlie Jones, and that's what the boys called him, although he didn't know at the time. He became influential not just in my education, but ultimately in the long-term association I had with the church and the choir in the church, and indeed the music which we attempted to play on the school band, or maybe fondly call it an orchestra.
And so Charlie got you started with the in the choir, but you carried on even when your voice had broken, and you became
yes, I joined the
Joplin.
Yes, I joined the choir through the introduction from C.T. Jones, and he mentored me in that regard. There was no resistance for me. I quite enjoyed it, and I happily became a choir boy at around 5 or 6. I certainly can remember that I wasn't tall enough to look over the pew in the choir stalls. I had to stand on a cassock in order that the top of my head which was a mass of blonde hair in those early days, looked over the top of the pews. But I became a choir boy and continued to be a regular choir boy and part of that choir team through until my voice broke. And then I was taken under the wing of the vicar, Reverend Jobling, who I think saw me as a budding vicar. And I say that with great affection because I spent many happy hours with him as he tried to guide me in that direction as a career. In between learning the ropes of what went on behind services, I became a server to the Reverend Jobling, and I helped in preparing him and the accoutrements needed for various services such as communion and other special events, participating also in village events which happened at the church, such as christenings, funerals and weddings.
And what about your first funeral? You got sixpence for a funeral, didn't you?
One of the advantages of being a little choir boy, or for me was an advantage, is it provided me with pocket money which I could race back to the shop and turn into sweets or occasionally maybe an ice cream. But in those days the standard rate was sixpence for a wedding or a funeral. And I remember my first funeral as being horrified because there was I peering over the top of the pew in front of me was a coffin which I'd never seen one before in my life, and I had horrible nightmares following this first occasion at a funeral.
And were you bell ringer too with your grandfather?
As things progressed, and sometimes not by choice, but my grandfather had been a bell ringer during his early youth in Kingsland Church, and somehow or other I got co-opted into bell ringing in addition to my service and other duties in the church. I enjoyed bell ringing, it was great fun, and often remember, as I was not too heavy a guy, often being swung off my feet as the bells went back to rest position.
And you have a story about decorating the church with wild flowers and collecting them.
Yeah, there were annual events in the village, many of which involved the church. And around Easter time, the young children, which included me and indeed Jennifer, and she remembers this as well, that we went out into the countryside and up as far as Ochre Wood, which was a great distance for us to be going as young people. And we picked primroses, violets, and sometimes in Ochre Wood were able to find lilies of the valley. And these were made up into quite decorative posies, all of which had leaves and were tied together with wool. And it had to be wool, so our parents told us. And these were then used in the church to decorate the church. And we had great fun, and it did look rather smart when we'd finished.
You had other relatives who lived at Moor House Farm. Can you tell us about your time there?
As you already know, my surname is Chamberlain, and the Chamberlain family, as I've researched it, goes back to, as far as I can research at the moment, to the 1600s. And my grandfather was Harry Chamberlain, and he had siblings, and he himself was born at Moor House Farm in Kingsland, which is there today.
And what were the things you learned at the farm? You learned to milk?
Oh yes, Moor House Farm provided most of the milk to all the residents in Kingsland, and the cows were pastured at a field near the church, and it was a great event. As I was in my 6-7-year-old age group, rather like cowboys and Indians, for me to walk behind the cows and sometimes not very easily encourage them to go back from their feeding to their place where they would be milked. And I remember my aunt organised that I learned how to hand milk the cows, which was quite interesting. And because I had small hands, it was quite difficult. But the cows were quite docile, and they played their part because the milk was lovely, and it was an experience to also be able to drink it warm.
And your aunt made cider as well, and butter?
Yes, not just milk for the village, but the farm produced eggs, and at Christmas time sold geese and chickens and turkeys to people who wanted them for their Christmas celebration meals. But as well as learning how to milk, I also participated in other activities as I grew and got a bit stronger on the farm, because it was a mixed farm of both animals and also crops. And I often remember in my early years being plonked on top of a rather large dray horse called Derby, and my feet hardly went across the width of his back, and this rather large horse took me nearly 2 meters off the ground, and we plodded up to fields, and I stayed on the horse's back as it ploughed diligently the furrows for us to plant potatoes in.
Gosh, goodness. Can you tell me about other food in the village? Your grandmother cooked on a range, but
Yes.
During the war, you told us that food was bartered for. And
Yes, technically during food purchases during the war, there was the infamous ration books that were technically in existence, and the rules surrounding them had to be obeyed. These were interpreted rather loosely within the village, and over a period of the war years and thereafter, bartering became a way of life, and people would exchange eggs for meat and vice versa, and also fruit and vegetables would be exchanged and bartered. And it became that we could become self-sufficient without the so-called ration books playing a significant part. The clever people in the various families would somehow edit these ration books so it did look like as if we were purchasing and using them. To my mind, they never got checked by anyone anyway.
can you tell me a little bit about your aunt's husband, who had come, I think, from Sweden?
Yes, the war years didn't have much impact on us. In fact, frankly, it's only in retrospect that we learned about activities in Herefordshire, the local activities in Shobden, where glider planes started out their journeys, and also one of my aunts worked in the munitions factory in Hereford. But rather closer to family ties was an immigrant from Sweden named Alfred Carlson, came into the village, and I know we had to report weekly to the local police constable since he was judged to be a threat to our security. He never was a threat to our security, and my security in particular, because he got married eventually into the Chamberlain family to Alice Chamberlain, who I knew as Auntie Nellie, and Auntie Nellie quickly became Mrs. Carlson. And he was a great help to me personally, because he developed skills like passing on knowledge of carpentry and husbandry, which I was like I've lost it.
A sponge?
A sponge, soaking up this new knowledge. And I remember, and still have to this day, working with him for many months on a solid oak bookcase when I was about 8 to 10 years old. And I still have this bookcase at home today.
Gosh, that's wonderful. Yeah. Now, you had another aunt living at home with your grandmother. and Aunt Gwen, and Auntie Nellie took you to see her when she wasn't well. And
Yes, yes.
perhaps you could say more about Gwen, because that's
Yes.
the reason that you're here this weekend.
Auntie Gwen was a large part in my early life, because nowadays I think she would be called a tomboy, but she loved to play football and race and climb trees, and I was either just in front of her or just behind her, either having her encouragement or encouraging her. But it meant that we enjoyed life and had many things to laugh about. Sadly, she joined the ATS in the war years and left Kingsland to fulfil her military duties. Unfortunately, she became quite badly ill, and when I was around 3 years old, I was taken by Auntie Nellie, who I've already referred to visit Aunt Gwen in Chester Military Hospital. We went by train from Leominster, and I remember this was my first train journey of any ilk, and a great adventure for me. And again, I always seem to have new clothing on special arrangements, as I mentioned when I first went to school. And Auntie Nellie had kitted me out in trousers, blazer, and a school cap. And much to my horror, as we got off the train in Chester Station, I dropped my new school cap between the carriage and the platform and looked down, and there it lay 3 or 4 feet down on the rail lines. Unperturbed, Auntie Nellie forbid the train to be moved until my cap was rescued, and eventually a volunteer was called for to crawl down under the train, and then my cap was reached upwards towards me, and I grabbed it with great relief and a few tears, I think, as well.
And what happened then to Gwen?
We went to Chester Military Hospital, where my Aunt Gwen was there in bed and rather ill, but she was pleased to see me, and I remember, although the reunion was slightly tearful, it remains with me a very poignant memory of her to this day, as subsequently, unfortunately, in 1944 she passed away at the tender age of 21 years of age, and subsequently was interred in Kingsland Churchyard under the war graves system.
And you have her medal, don't you?
Yes, in doing research for the family Chamberlain name, I've also been able to return to the family her war medal, which is a medal presented to the families of those that were deceased as a result of war activity. And this I have, and I will this year be wearing it with some degree of pride at the remembrance service in Kingsland Church.
That's wonderful. Another wartime memory you told us about was the army truck and what they gave you from the back of the truck.
Yes, Kingsland was, as we all know, but even greater in the 40s and 50s, was still rather isolated and, dare I say it, behind the times. And I remember seeing the first non-white person in all my life, other than pictures in books or newspapers, since this preceded television. And the occasion was this large army truck, all decorated with camouflage colours, stopped outside the Corners Inn. And this is where us young boys used to gather occasionally to make fun at other people. The canvas awning on the truck was opened, and 2 non-white faces stared down at me, and I always remember large shining teeth looked pleased almost to see us, in a language which I still can't understand, but it was English or American English, and we were offered fruits and some chocolate wafers that we had never seen in the shops. Indeed, I'd never seen them before. We swapped amongst the lads who wanted what, and I had this rather funny looking thing which was yellow and didn't seem to make sense to me. I took it home, and eventually I realised that what I had with me was my first taste of a banana.
And your grandmother had never seen one? Your grandmother hadn't ever seen a banana?
True, yes. We had to ponder on this funny looking vegetable, as we didn't know what it was and didn't even know that it had to be peeled. And my grandmother and my grandfather hadn't seen one either. And so we went next door to where another aunt lived, and she, because she'd spent time in London, was aware of these exotic fruits and was able to educate us in the culinary arts of peeling a banana.
It's wonderful. Now, Myrtle Cottage didn't have any facilities really, no electricity. Your water came from a pump to a well outside. Toilets was down the garden. Can you tell me about when electricity first came and the street light?
Yes, it was long overdue, but a great excitement in the village when we had electricity. Not just the fact that we had greater facilities at our homes and our houses, and indeed the businesses that existed, such as the shop in the centre of the village, and we had one room with a light because you had to pay to have the electric cables fitted. But the great event that took place when we were out and about was we saw the first public lamp post with an electric light in it fitted in Kingsland, and this was on the entrance to Borefield housing, and all the young people from that area, which included us, we all gathered round this, and it became rather like a maypole as we youngsters danced around it with glee as the light came on, and for the first time we had a village light.
Incredible. After Kingsland School, you went to Lucton. You got a scholarship. I believe you took the entrance exam 18 months early.
Yes. I think with the mentoring that we had both from the vicar and C.T. Jones at Kingsland School, I was a bit of a precocious lad and somehow passed my entrance exam way ahead of normal time, and so ultimately won a scholarship after not having just passed the exam, but also passing the interview which took place with the headmaster at Lucton School. He was the ultimate arbiter on whether you could attend the school, and it wasn't just passing the exam that gave you automatic entrance to Lucton. It was also convincing the headmaster that you were a suitable applicant, which was rather scary because it was my first formal interview. But somehow I made it, and then started my next stage of education at Lucton School, which provided me with the education which has allowed me to live a very fulfilling life.
And you went there by bicycle?
Yes, a group of us used to cycle up to Lucton every morning and come back every evening. And that group was, the core group was Robin East, Brian Markham and myself, and we always went up Lugg Lane from Kingsland in order to get to Lucton by the shortest route, and of course arrive at school on time to be at assembly.
Good. And you enjoyed sport, I believe not cricket, but rugby and athletics?
Yes, I enjoyed sport rather more than the formal education, and would have been happy to have been on the rugby field all the time rather than in lessons. And I had some skills in rugby and enjoyed rugby tremendously and continued to play it up to the tender age of 40 years old. I played for all the teams at Lucton School, including the first 15, and also ran out and played for Herefordshire schoolboys in Hereford for a few matches as well, which I was rather pleased with, and it was a bit of an accolade because I was the only Luctonian at that stage that had played for Herefordshire schoolboys. But I enjoyed sport tremendously and the camaraderie that went with it, and also meeting new friends as we visited schools within the region to play them in open competition.
And CCF was very much part of Lucton's
Yes,
life.
CCF was an integral part of the school, and for one day every week we dressed up in our full khaki uniform, and we had to perform all the routines that preceded that by making sure that the uniforms themselves were clean, that the belts were blancoed and the brasswork was gleaming, and also gleaming had to be our boots. And we were dutifully inspected by the visiting officers that was running the day's military instruction. I eventually did quite well at CCF, and it was quite interesting. I was a good rifle shot and won one of the annual prizes for accuracy on the rifle range, as Lucton School had its own rifle range itself then in those days, and we were issued with 303 active rifles, and to fire live bullets at a target was in itself quite exciting.
Yeah. And I believe you went to Norfolk.
Yes, the Black Watch Regiment invited boys from the school to spend a 2-week actual live event at their camp. And this one that I went to one particular year was in Stiffkey in Norfolk, on what is now the Norfolk Broads. In those days it was used as a training ground for the Black Watch. And I remember one particular event where we had to black our faces with burnt cork in order to go on night exercises. And I remember that because it was blackout and there was no lights, and we were going across what are the Norfolk Broads, and there are a lot of deep gullies which are filled with water, and I experienced this by falling in many of them. And so coming back to the camp when it got light the next morning, thoroughly wet, thoroughly tired and mucky, only to find that we had no washing facilities other than the tank of water that was used to wash our dishes when we'd had breakfast, and this was rather greasy. Indeed, there was bits of fried bread and broken egg floating on the top, and to use this greasy water to try and remove black cork off your face was in itself a task which never worked out.
When you weren't at school, there wasn't much entertainment in the village. You essentially made your own, I believe, but there was a youth club.
Yes, the youth club was an important part of village life for the young people. Entertainment was almost non-existent. It was a long way to Leominster for youngsters, and in fact almost forbidden to go there unaccompanied, certainly at our early age. And to know that we would have a building with table tennis tables and other activities where we could go and have fun was a great joy, and it was within easy walking distance of the centre of the village. And that was a great part in again having extended friendships and doing different things and being independent of one's parents.
And I know you swim in the river and play football in the road. And
yes.
And you did talk about Easter parades and that kind of thing.
Yes, I mentioned earlier when we were collecting flowers for the church, there was also an annual Easter parade where this was held in the church, in the field adjacent to the school. It involved races. People would also produce fruit and vegetables which were judged and this was rather adult activities, but there was also foot races where you jumped over straw bales and over carts, and the carts were there courtesy of the local farmers, and many of the carts were decorated specially for that day's event as they paraded through the village before they were parked up to act as the obstacle for the various races.
Lovely. Yeah.
I was very pleased that my athletic prowess at Lucton School helped me to win one of those races, and again I was happy to have the staggering amount of £5 to spend because it was an adult race, although I sneaked in at the tender age of 15.
Gosh, that's a lot of money in those days. Also, courtesy of Maurice Markham, I believe there were trips and excursions.
Yes, other than Primrose Motors, Markham's buses were the primary methods where we were able to escape from the village. And again, it was at least once per annum the village children were able to enjoy this facility by pottering our way between Kingsland and Aberystwyth. And Mr. Markham, a much beloved parent and the driver of the bus, although he had one fixed speed, and despite encouragement for us children, that was the speed at which we travelled. But needless to say, because the journey was rather extended as a result of the slowness of the vehicle, by the time we reached Aberystwyth, we'd all consumed our sandwiches, which technically had been made for us to eat at lunchtime. But this was thoroughly enjoyable, and of course a visit to the seaside was a great event, and one saved up one's little bit of pocket money so that you could buy some rock and also a genuine ice cream at the seaside.
And I believe he entertained you when it was snowing one year, 1947.
Yes. I remember back in 1947 there was a horrible winter, not just in Kingsland and Herefordshire, but nationally. And I do remember that the snow outside our little house on Lugg Lane was as deep as the top of my head, and we had to cut an alleyway in the snow in order to get in and out of our house. But Maurice used this opportunity, as he always did, to entertain us children, and I remember him tying my sledge on a length of rope behind a car from his garage, and he took us round the roads of Kingsland, swinging and swaying rather precariously and hanging on for grim death on our little sledges. As they went round the corner, we were swinging like yo-yos on the back of his car. I'm not sure whether we enjoyed it or we were too scared to complain, but it was fun, and I look back on it as being certainly things that would never happen today, with health and safety rules being what they are.
That's true. Now, some of your family lived in the cottages at Lugg Green, and at one, it must have been a weir that burst, was it?
Yes, it was around the 47 time, and I think because of the heavy snows across the whole of the country, a dam had burst upstream from the River Lugg, and my grandma's sister and their parents had lived originally at Lugg Green cottages, and as this dam burst and the great volume of water came down the Lugg, those cottages were in fact flooded out to the depth of above the doorway at the first floor, so you couldn't see anything of the ground floor rooms. Because I could swim, we'd already learned to swim as lads in the village in the River Lugg when it was not in flood, and during the summer time, my parents and my aunt cajoled me into swimming through this flood water and scrambling in to the bedroom window to retrieve some clothing, because they were not able to live at the cottage and had moved in temporarily with us in Myrtle House. As I opened the window and looked in and could see, even in the bedroom, a little bit of water on the floor, And as I was looking in, two other eyes looked out at me, and there was a rat that didn't encourage me to come in at all, as I've got to admit, probably a bit scared of the thing. But I scrambled in because I had my instructions of what clothing I had to get, and completed my task, but I didn't go back again.
And the family then went to live at the hostel, just the other side of the crossroads, and you have memories of that as well, I think.
Yes, temporary accommodation was provided to my aunt because they couldn't live with us in our small cottage at Myrtle House indefinitely. It was just a temporary arrangement, as families do, under extreme conditions. But they were rehoused, again, supposedly temporary, in the hostel. And that was a great time for me to be able to use my bicycle in my free time to go and visit my Aunt Betsy at her new small home, because she baked tremendously nice cakes, and I always used to time it because I knew that she baked cakes at a certain time, and it was just by chance that I happened to be passing by. But I think she knew what my motives were and never complained when she cut me a big slice of cake.
Lovely. Now, when you were 3 or 4, your mother met your stepfather. He was in the army but posted to Leominster, and they married but moved to Halifax. You stayed with your grandmother, and they used to come and visit. Can you tell a little bit about those visits and how you would all stay?
Yes,
as the girls, your
yes,
half sisters grew up.
yes, yes. My father was a military man. He was based in Leominster after he'd spent time over in France and Germany, actually fighting in the war, in the infantry. He was injured, and the injuries continued to thwart him throughout his life. But he met my mum in Leominster, and eventually they got married and moved to the north of England, and 3 of my female siblings arrived in short order. And of course, living in a town in the north of England, it pleased them all to come and visit us in Kingsland, and we were delighted to have them. And every 2 week periods, they would come down each year, roughly in August or September, and spend time with us. It was an almighty upheaval to actually squeeze in another 5 people into our 2-bedroomed cottage. And obviously, as I grew older, I was certainly not allowed to remain during sleeping hours at Myrtle House. And the auspices of the Markham family came into play in that we would sleep in a temporary bedroom above the garage, which again was a great adventure because it meant we were away from parental supervision.
Yes. And even when you'd left home and gone up north, you would drive your mother and stepfather down for a visit in Kingsland.
Yes. After I left Kingsland, I had been enrolled with a company called ICI in Manchester on a scholarship which involved study and working in their premises. And this I had to do for 4 or 5 years, and so lived most of my time in Manchester. And for people that know about football, I was put up into very basic student accommodation, a stone's throw from where Manchester United football ground existed. And so ever since those days, I've still, for better or for worse, been a supporter of Manchester United Football Club. But part of the annual ritual became that I acted as driver and brought down my immediate family of 5 plus me as the driver, and we all squeezed in my little car on its journey between Yorkshire and Herefordshire. And this was looked forward to because it was a reuniting not just of the families but of their involvements and their new experiences, because some of my stepsisters were born in a town and not in the countryside, and so for the first time in their lives they saw the countryside and all its differences between there and the town that they lived in.
And I believe you stayed at Stone House, bed and breakfast.
Because, as I've mentioned earlier, Myrtle House was quite small. As we grew up, we had to provide and find other accommodation, and Stone House was one choice that we made, and we stayed there for a number of years consecutively. And I often smile at one event which took place when my youngest sister, who I liked to tease, and I didn't have to tease one day because she ran in and went up to the bedroom that they were going to occupy, and when she opened the window, a bat flew in, and she freaked out and ran down the stairs screaming, much to my enjoyment.
I think we've gone through almost everything, but we haven't really clarified the names of your grandparents and even your mother, and the fact that your grandparents followed you up north.
Yes.
And
yes. Well, my grandparents naturally had their married name was Chamberlain, but Harry Chamberlain was my grandfather, and Clara Chamberlain, the wife, originated as Clara Tongue, Tonge, and she was born in their family house, as I mentioned, at Lugg Lane.
that's fine. It's just a wonderful story about the 3-seater toilet at Moor Farm. Do you want to say that?
Sorry?
This wonderful story about the 3-seater. Just to finish.
One of my many adventures when visiting Auntie Nellie at Moor Farm, as I routinely after school in my early days at Kingsland School, I would potter down from Myrtle House to Moor House Farm with a metal tin container to get the daily supply of fresh milk from the farm. Often when I was there, nature would call and I would ask my aunt if I could use their toilet facilities, which were about 50 yards from the house up at the end of the garden. And this was a rather ornate building, and it was over a stream which ran through the periphery of the farm, and inside was a carpenter's delight insofar that there was facilities to accommodate 3 people at the same time with no divisions between them, and each of these little seating areas were sized so that 2 were adult and 1 was a child. I've already indicated, I think earlier, to my rather impish behaviour, and one of the things I used to do if the ducks were around swimming in this little pond was I would stand on the seat and with good aim water the ducks.
And your grandmother sold the eggs. Your aunt sold the eggs. I thought that was just that.
Big.
Family. Is what you said.
Yes, yes. I've touched on family life and, to some extent, Kingsland activity. The enduring features of growing up in all my formative years in Kingsland remain very firmly as the basis on my personal endeavours through life and my beliefs in basic things such as Christianity, doing right, being careful, being polite. And all these things were embedded in what I believe to be the ethics surrounding family and community life within Kingsland, where we lived as a very much a large family, where you could openly go anywhere in Kingsland. When you were very small, the adults would, without your knowledge, keep an eye on you to make sure that you were safe, and even if you were doing rather naughty things, they would correct you. If you didn't take notice, there would always be a postscript, such as, if you do that again, we'll tell your mum or your dad. And the policeman at the time would do rather the same thing. We would always get a telling off, and the final retort would always be, if I see you scrumping apples again, I'll tell your mum and dad.
Wonderful. Well, John, thank you so much. That's just marvellous. No postscripts. The policeman lived in the village, of course, didn't he?
Yes.
Yes.
Those were the days of village policemen.
Yeah.
They were an important part. I think the other unique feature, which I certainly fondly remember, is at the time when the magic of television. I remember watching television on the little purple, not black and white even in those days, of the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. And the other endearing feature of village life was, if you made a telephone call, you picked up the receiver and a lady in person answered from the post office, and she would know your name because she'd know where you were calling from, and she would say, "Hello John, who do you want to speak to?" And you would say so and so, and you'd either get put through to number 12 or 22. The numbers didn't go very high. Or if they were not at home, she would say to you, "Do you want me to tell them that you called, or shall I put you through to where they're visiting?" And this was a much better system even than the modern mobile phone as it runs today.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Good.
Let's put it off. Let's see.